Isolated by a fierce snowstorm, veteran Jack Callahan thought the howling wind was his greatest threat. He was wrong. Inside the cabin, his ever-calm service dog, Ghost, began to act strangely. He wasn't afraid of the storm, but was obsessed with the stone fireplace, scratching and whining with an unusual urgency. Jack understood immediately. This wasn't fear, but a warning. What could be hidden beneath solid stone that only his dog could sense? A secret buried for 15 years. He knew he had to trust his only companion and uncover the truth that someone was willing to kill to hide. The air in the Flathead County Courthouse was thick with tension, smelling of old paperwork, nervous sweat, and the metallic tang of bitter coffee. It was the smell of desperation, a scent Jack Callahan had hoped to leave behind forever when he left the Army. He sat on a hard wooden bench near the back, a solitary figure in a room full of chattering neighbors and calculating real estate speculators. His posture was ramrod straight, a habit drilled into him over 2 decades in the United States Army Rangers. But his gaze was distant, fixed on a rain-streaked window rather than the auctioneer's podium at the front. At his feet, lying with a quiet dignity that seemed almost out of place in the chaotic room, was Ghost. The dog was a German shepherd, though his coloring was a rarity that always drew questions. Instead of the typical black and tan, Ghost's thick double coat was a stunning mix of silver gray and pale cream, a wolf-like sable that had grown softer and lighter with age. At 8 years old, he was retired from a life of service Jack rarely spoke of. His muzzle was frosted with white, and the amber of his intelligent eyes held a deep, knowing calm. He was more than a dog. He was an anchor, the silent keeper of Jack's sanity. Jack himself was a man carved from the same quiet resilience. In his late 40s, he was tall and lean, with a strength that was wiry rather than bulky. His brown hair, cut short and practical, was threaded with silver at the temples. His face was a map of his life, lines of concentration etched around his kind blue eyes, and a faint pale scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a memento from a long-forgotten firefight in a place he'd rather forget. He wore what had become his uniform in civilian life, a simple gray t-shirt under a worn but clean plaid flannel shirt, faded blue jeans, and sturdy work boots. He sought not comfort, but function. He sought not conversation, but solitude. The auctioneer, a portly man with a droning voice, moved through the list of foreclosed properties and seized assets with practiced monotony. A pickup truck from 2012, a set of industrial tools, a small ranch house on the outskirts of town. For each item, a flurry of hands would shoot up, a brief competitive dance that Jack ignored completely. He was waiting for one thing, a ghost on the county ledger that he'd discovered 2 weeks ago while searching for cheap land far from civilization. All right, next up, the auctioneer sighed, adjusting his glasses with visible reluctance. We have parcel 7B, known locally as the Old Miller Place. A subtle shift occurred in the room. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a collective intake of breath, a sudden stillness. The low hum of whispered conversations ceased entirely. Several attendees exchanged nervous glances. One elderly woman made the sign of the cross. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice now completely devoid of its already minimal enthusiasm. Property consists of 160 acres, a single-story cabin, condition listed as poor. 1 well, status unknown. This property is sold as is, where is. It comes to the county by way of tax delinquency. 15 years of unpaid property taxes. 15 years. The number hung in the stale air like a curse. It was an eternity for a piece of land to sit in limbo, untouched and unwanted. Jack felt the stares of the other attendees pivot from the auctioneer to him, the only stranger in the room. They knew why he was here. He had asked about the parcel at the county clerk's office last week, and in a town this small, word traveled faster than wildfire. We'll open the bidding at $500, the auctioneer said, his tone suggesting he didn't expect to get even that. Jack raised his hand, a calm, steady gesture that cut through the silence like a blade. 500, he said, his voice quiet but clear. The auctioneer's eyes found him. and something flickered across the man's face. Pity, perhaps, or maybe warning. The room remained silent. No competing bids. No eager speculators jumping at a steal. Just uncomfortable silence and the sound of rain hammering against the windows. Going once, the auctioneer said mechanically. Going twice. He paused, as if giving the room one last chance to save this stranger from himself. Sold. Parcel 7B to bidder number 17. The gavel came down with a hollow thunk that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Jack felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the weight of every pair of eyes in the room now fixed on him with a mixture of fear and sympathy. As he stood to collect his paperwork, Ghost rose with him, pressing close to his leg in the way he always did when he sensed Jack's unease. An elderly man in overalls leaned across the aisle as Jack passed, his weathered face grave. "That land ain't been touched since Arthur Miller disappeared," the old man whispered. "There's a reason for that, son. There's things up in those mountains that ought to stay buried." Jack nodded politely, but said nothing. He'd heard the warnings before, at the clerk's office at the gas station, even from the realtor who'd refused to show him the property in person. Cursed land. Bad luck. A journalist who'd vanished without a trace 15 years ago. Ghost stories meant to keep property values low and curiosity at bay. Jack didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in solitude, in starting over, in finding a place where his nightmares couldn't reach anyone else. As he stepped out into the cold Montana rain, Ghost at his heels, Jack had no way of knowing that the warnings weren't superstition. They were survival advice. And he'd just bought himself a death sentence for $500. The air in the Flathead County Courthouse was thick with tension, smelling of old paperwork, nervous sweat, and the metallic tang of bitter coffee. It was the smell of desperation, a scent Jack Callahan had hoped to leave behind forever when he left the Army. He sat on a hard wooden bench near the back, a solitary figure in a room full of chattering neighbors and calculating real estate speculators. His posture was ramrod straight, a habit drilled into him over 2 decades in the United States Army Rangers. But his gaze was distant, fixed on the rain-streaked window rather than the auctioneer's podium at the front. At his feet, lying with a quiet dignity that seemed almost out of place in the chaotic room, was Ghost. The dog was a German shepherd, though his coloring was a rarity that always drew questions. Instead of the typical black and tan, Ghost's thick double coat was a stunning mix of silver gray and pale cream, a wolf-like sable that had grown softer and lighter with age. At 8 years old, he was retired from a life of service Jack rarely spoke of. His muzzle was frosted with white, and the amber of his intelligent eyes held a deep, knowing calm. He was more than a dog. He was an anchor, the silent keeper of Jack's sanity. Jack himself was a man carved from the same quiet resilience. In his late 40s, he was tall and lean, with a strength that was wiry rather than bulky. His brown hair, cut short and practical, was threaded with silver at the temples. His face was a map of his life. Lines of concentration etched around his kind blue eyes, and a faint pale scar that bisected his left eyebrow. A memento from a long-forgotten firefight in a place he'd rather forget. He wore what had become his uniform in civilian life. A simple gray t-shirt under a worn but clean plaid flannel shirt, faded blue jeans, and sturdy work boots. He sought not comfort, but function. He sought not conversation, but solitude. The auctioneer, a portly man with a droning voice, moved through the list of foreclosed properties and seized assets with practiced monotony. A pickup truck from 2012, a set of industrial tools, a small ranch house on the outskirts of town. For each item, a flurry of hands would shoot up, a brief competitive dance that Jack ignored completely. He was waiting for one thing, a ghost on the county ledger that he'd discovered 2 weeks ago while searching for cheap land far from civilization. All right, next up, the auctioneer sighed, adjusting his glasses with visible reluctance. We have Parcel 7B, known locally as the Old Miller Place. A subtle shift occurred in the room. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a collective intake of breath, a sudden stillness. The low hum of whispered conversations ceased entirely. Several attendees exchanged nervous glances. One elderly woman made the sign of the cross. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice now completely devoid of its already minimal enthusiasm. Property consists of 160 acres, a single-story cabin, condition listed as poor. One well, status unknown. This property is sold as is, where is. It comes to the county by way of tax delinquency. 15 years of unpaid property taxes. 15 years. The number hung in the stale air like a curse. It was an eternity for a piece of land to sit in limbo, untouched and unwanted. Jack felt the stares of the other attendees pivot from the auctioneer to him, the only stranger in the room. They knew why he was here. He had asked about the parcel at the county clerk's office last week, and in a town this small, word traveled faster than wildfire. "We'll open the bidding at $500, the auctioneer said, his tone suggesting he didn't expect to get even that. Jack raised his hand, a calm, steady gesture that cut through the silence like a blade. 500, he said, his voice quiet but clear. The auctioneer's eyes found him, and something flickered across the man's face. Pity, perhaps, or maybe warning. The room remained silent. No competing bids. No eager speculators jumping at a steal. Just uncomfortable silence and the sound of rain hammering against the windows. Going once, the auctioneer said mechanically. Going twice. He paused, as if giving the room one last chance to save this stranger from himself. Sold. Parcel 7B to bidder number 17. The gavel came down with a hollow thunk that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Jack felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Only the weight of every pair of eyes in the room now fixed on him with a mixture of fear and sympathy. As he stood to collect his paperwork, Ghost rose with him, pressing close to his leg in the way he always did when he sensed Jack's unease. An elderly man in overalls leaned across the aisle as Jack passed, his weathered face grave. "That land ain't been touched since Arthur Miller disappeared," the old man whispered. "There's a reason for that, son. There's things up in those mountains that ought to stay buried." Jack nodded politely, but said nothing. He'd heard the warnings before, at the clerk's office at the gas station, even from the realtor who'd refused to show him the property in person. Cursed land. Bad luck. A journalist who'd vanished without a trace 15 years ago. Ghost stories meant to keep property values low and curiosity at bay. Jack didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in solitude, in starting over, in finding a place where his nightmares couldn't reach anyone else. The processing window was in an adjacent room, separated from the main auction hall by a frosted glass door. Jack waited in line behind a young couple who'd won the bid on a foreclosed condo, their excited whispers about renovation plans a stark contrast to the heavy silence that followed him. When his turn came, the clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, pulled up his information without meeting his eyes. "Bidder 17, she said, her voice flat. "Parcel 7B. That'll be $500 plus a $30 processing fee, plus the back taxes owed." Jack had expected this. How much are the back taxes? 15 years at the delinquent rate. She typed rapidly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. That comes to $8,000 for $173. Nearly $9,000 total. It was still less than 3 months' rent in any city, less than a decent used truck. Jack had his life savings in a canvas bag in his truck, $20,000 to $1,000 in cash from selling everything he owned after his medical discharge. He'd planned for this. "I can pay cash," he said. For the first time, the clerk looked up at him, her expression unreadable behind her glasses. "You're serious about this?" "Yes, ma'am." She held his gaze for a long moment, then looked down at Ghost, who sat patiently at Jack's side. Something softened in her face, just a fraction, but Jack noticed. "That's a good dog you've got there." "He is. You'll need him." She said it so quietly Jack almost missed it. Then, louder in her official voice, "I'll need to see identification and count the cash. This may take a few minutes." 20 minutes later, Jack walked out of the courthouse with a manila folder containing the deed to 160 acres of Montana wilderness, a hand-drawn map with questionable accuracy, and a single key on a rusted ring. The rain had intensified, turning the parking lot into a maze of puddles that reflected the gray sky like shattered mirrors. Ghost paused at the top of the courthouse steps, his ears swiveling forward. Jack followed his gaze across the parking lot to where a sheriff's cruiser idled near the exit, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm. Through the rain-blurred glass, Jack could make out a figure watching them. The driver didn't move, didn't wave, just watched with an intensity that Jack recognized from his military days. The surveillance stare of someone cataloging threats. "Come on, boy," Jack said quietly, descending the steps. Ghost stayed close, his body tense in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. They reached Jack's truck, a battered 2008 Ford F-150 with Montana plates he'd bought for cash 3 weeks ago, and Jack opened the passenger door for Ghost before circling to the driver's side. As he climbed in, he glanced back at the cruiser. It was still there, still watching. Jack could see the sheriff's insignia on the door now, and something else, a small decal he couldn't quite make out through the rain. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, taking the long way around to avoid passing too close to the cruiser. In his rearview mirror, he watched it sit motionless for several seconds before finally pulling out in the opposite direction. Ghost whined softly, a sound Jack had learned to interpret over 8 years of partnership. Uncertainty, concern. The dog's instincts had kept them both alive in places where intel was bad and enemies wore friendly faces. "I know," Jack said, one hand dropping to scratch behind Ghost's ears. "I know, buddy, but it's just small-town politics. They don't like outsiders buying up property." Ghost turned his amber eyes on Jack with an expression that seemed almost human in its skepticism. Jack drove through the rain-soaked streets of Whitefish, Montana, a town that wore its tourist trap charm like an uncomfortable suit. Boutique shops and craft breweries occupied buildings that had once been feed stores and hardware shops. The mountains loomed in every direction, their peaks hidden by low clouds that promised snow before nightfall. October in Montana meant winter was coming fast, and Jack intended to be settled before the first real storm hit. He stopped at a gas station on the edge of town, filling up the truck and buying supplies, bottled water, instant coffee, batteries, a new flashlight. The teenager behind the counter barely looked at him, more interested in his phone than his customers. Jack preferred it that way. Back in the truck, he spread the hand-drawn map across the steering wheel. The property was marked with a red X about 40 minutes north, accessible by Highway 93 and then a series of increasingly remote forest roads. The last 2 miles were marked 4WD recommended in block letters. Below that, someone had added in pencil, impassable in snow. Jack had 3 weeks, maybe 4 if the weather held, to prepare the cabin for winter. It would be tight, but he'd operated on tighter timelines in worse conditions. The Army had taught him to adapt, to make do with whatever was available, to survive when survival seemed impossible. What the Army hadn't taught him was how to live with the silence afterward, how to sleep through a full night without waking to phantom sounds of gunfire, how to exist in a world that kept spinning while part of him remained frozen in the desert, watching his team die because he'd made the wrong call. Ghost nudged his hand, pulling Jack back from the edge of memory. The dog had a gift for sensing when Jack's thoughts turned dark, for anchoring him to the present before the past could pull him under. "All right," Jack said, folding the map and tucking into the folder with the deed. "Let's go see what we bought." He pulled back onto the highway, heading north. The rain followed them like a shadow, drumming against the roof of the truck in a rhythm that should have been soothing but felt instead like a warning. In the passenger seat, Ghost stared out the window at the passing forest, his body alert, his ears tracking sounds Jack couldn't hear. Neither of them noticed the sheriff's cruiser that pulled onto the highway 3 cars back, maintaining a careful distance as they drove deeper into the mountains, toward the land that no one wanted and the cabin that had been waiting, empty and patient, for someone foolish enough to disturb 15 years of silence. Jack had intended to drive straight to the property, but practical necessity pulled him off Highway 93 at the small junction town of Columbia Falls. The hand-drawn map showed nothing in the way of infrastructure near Parcel 7B. No power lines, no neighbors, no services. If he was going to spend the night on the property, he He needed more than the basic supplies he grabbed at the gas station. He needed a plan, and he needed information about what he was walking into. Abernathy's General Store sat at the corner of Main Street and Nucleus Avenue. A weathered building that looked like it had been standing since Montana was still a territory. The wooden sign hanging above the door was hand-painted, the letters faded but still legible. A bell jangled as Jack pushed through the entrance, Ghost at his heels. The interior smelled of sawdust, lamp oil, and something sweet, cinnamon, maybe or cloves. Shelves lined every wall, packed tight with an improbable mixture of goods. Camping equipment next to canning supplies, ammunition beside bags of dog food, fishing tackle mixed with children's toys. It was the kind of store that served a rural population that couldn't afford to drive an hour for every forgotten item. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with a thick gray beard and sharp blue eyes that tracked Jack's movement from the moment he entered. He wore a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows and an expression that suggested he'd seen everything twice and hadn't been impressed the first time. "Help you find something?" The man's voice was gravel and whiskey, rough but not unfriendly. "Need supplies for a few weeks off-grid," Jack said, approaching the counter. "Propane if you've got it, kerosene, basic food stores. Figured I'd ask what you recommend before I start grabbing things." The man's eyes flicked down to Ghost, who sat calmly at Jack's side, then back up to Jack's face. "You're the one who bought the Miller place." It wasn't a question. Jack had learned in the past 2 hours that news traveled at light speed in small towns. "That's right. Bill Abernathy," the man said, extending a hand across the counter. His grip was firm, calloused, the handshake of someone who still worked with his hands. "This is my store. Been here 42 years, my father 30 years before that." Jack Callahan. Abernathy nodded slowly, releasing Jack's hand. "Army. Rangers. Retired. Marines myself. Long time ago." Abernathy studied him for a moment, then sighed and reached under the counter, pulling out a worn notebook and a pencil. "All right, let's make you a list. You got any idea what kind of shape the cabin's in?" "County said poor. County's being generous." Abernathy started writing. "The Miller place has been sitting empty for 15 years. That means mice, probably some water damage, definitely mold. You'll need traps, bleach, tarps. The well might still work, but you want to test the water before you drink it. I've got test kits." He paused, tapping the pencil against his lips. "You planning to stay through winter?" "That's the idea." Abernathy's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "In that cabin?" "Son, I'm not sure you understand what you're—" "I understand it'll be rough," Jack interrupted gently. "I'm prepared for that." The older man held his gaze for a long moment, then returned to the list. "Wood stove still there, far as I know. You'll need an axe, a bow saw, stove pipe, probably need to replace whatever's there, and about 3 cords of wood if you're serious about not freezing to death. I can sell you 1 cord here, but you'll need to cut the rest yourself. Plenty of deadfall on that land. Appreciate it. You got a weapon?" Jack hesitated. "Service pistol. Glock 19. Bring a rifle. Grizzlies come down from the high country this time of year, looking for food before they den up. You see one. You do not want to be relying on a pistol." Abernathy added something to the list. "I've got a Remington 700 in .30-06. Good condition, 500 rounds. I'll sell it to you for 600. That's a cost." It was a fair price, more than fair. Jack nodded. "Deal." They spent the next 20 minutes going through the list, Abernathy adding items with the efficiency of someone who'd outfitted dozens of people for mountain living. Jack appreciated the lack of questions, the businesslike approach. But he could feel something building beneath the surface, a tension in the way Abernathy's jaw tightened when he mentioned the property, the way his eyes kept drifting to the window as if expecting someone. Finally, as Jack was examining a kerosene lantern, Abernathy set down his pencil and folded his arms across his chest. "I need to say something, and I need you to listen." Jack turned to face him fully, giving him his complete attention. "Arthur Miller was a good man," Abernathy said quietly. "He wasn't from here. Came up from Billings, worked for one of the newspapers there. He bought that land 12, maybe 13 years ago. Had some idea about writing a book, living off the grid, getting back to basics. Same thing you're probably thinking. Jack said nothing, just listened. He'd come into town once a week for supplies. Always friendly, always paid cash, never caused trouble. Then about 18 months after he moved out there, he started asking questions. Abernathy's voice dropped lower, and his eyes flicked toward the door as if checking for eavesdroppers. Questions about the water quality in the valley, about livestock dying on farms north of here, about a mining operation that supposedly shut down in the 70s. Something cold settled in Jack's gut. What kind of questions? The kind that make powerful people nervous. GeoCorp, they own half the mineral rights in this county. Miller started suggesting they were dumping something in the groundwater, something that was poisoning the aquifer. Abernathy shook his head. Nobody wanted to believe it. GeoCorp employs 300 people in this valley. They sponsor the high school football team. The CEO sits on the town council. You don't make accusations like that without proof. Did Miller have proof? He said he did. Said he had water samples, documents, the whole thing. He was going to publish it in the Billings Gazette, blow the whole thing wide open. Abernathy's expression darkened. That was 15 years ago this November. 3 days before his article was supposed to run, Arthur Miller disappeared. The bell above the door jangled, and both men turned sharply. A young woman entered, shaking rain from her umbrella, oblivious to the tension she'd interrupted. She waved cheerfully at Abernathy and disappeared down one of the aisles. Abernathy waited until she was out of earshot, then continued in a near whisper. His truck was found parked at the cabin. Keys in the ignition, wallet on the seat. Even his dog was still there, half-starved but alive. Sheriff ruled it a voluntary disappearance. Said Miller probably just walked off into the woods. Suggested maybe he'd made the whole thing up and couldn't face the embarrassment. You don't believe that? I believe Arthur Miller was murdered, Abernathy said flatly. And I believe whoever did it wanted that property to sit empty and forgotten. They let the taxes pile up, let the rumors spread about it being cursed or haunted or whatever nonsense keeps people away. And it worked. For 15 years, nobody touched it. Jack felt ghosts shift beside him, the dog's body tense. Until me. Until you. Abernathy reached under the counter again, this time pulling out a business card that looked like it had been sitting there for a long time. If you find anything out there, anything that looks like Miller's research, any papers or samples or evidence, you call this number. It's a friend of mine, used to work for the EPA before they cleaned house. He's retired now, but he'd know what to do with it. Jack took the card, studying the name, Dr. Robert Shun, followed by a phone number with a Seattle area code. He tucked it into his shirt pocket. Why are you telling me this? Because you're military. Because you've got that look like you're running from something, and men running from something don't scare easy. Abernathy's expression softened slightly. And because that dog of yours deserved better than to watch you disappear into those mountains. The young woman emerged from the aisles with a basket of supplies, and the moment broke. Abernathy straightened, his professional demeanor sliding back into place like a mask. Let me get you things together. It'll take about an hour to load everything. You want some coffee while you wait? Coffee would be good. While Abernathy rang up the young woman's purchases, Jack walked to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked street. A sheriff's cruiser was parked across the street, same make and model as the one that had followed him from the courthouse. He couldn't see inside through the rain-streaked windows, but he didn't need to. Someone was watching. Someone wanted him to know he was being watched. Ghost pressed against his leg, and Jack dropped a hand to the dog's head. "It's all right, boy," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the dog or himself. Behind him, the bell jangled as the young woman left. Abernathy appeared at his shoulder, holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee. "That'll be Sheriff Riggs," he said quietly, following Jack's gaze. "He's GeoCorp's man through and through. His brother-in-law is on their board of directors. He was at the courthouse, too. I expect he'll be at the property later, just to check on you. Make sure you're settling in all right." Abernathy's tone made it clear exactly what kind of checking he meant. Jack accepted the coffee mug, wrapping his hands around the warmth. "I'm not Arthur Miller. I'm not looking to expose anyone or write any articles. I just want to be left alone." That's what Miller said at first, too. Abernathy took a sip of his coffee, his eyes still on the cruiser. The problem is, son, that land knows things. And if you're the curious type, you're going to find them whether you want to or not. They stood together in silence, watching the rain fall and the cruiser sit motionless across the street, a predator waiting with infinite patience. Jack thought about turning around, about walking away from the deed in his pocket and the property he'd bought sight unseen. He thought about finding another town, another cabin, another escape. But he'd been running for 2 years, and he was tired of running. Besides, he'd paid $9,000 for 160 acres of curse land. He might as well see what the curse looked like up close. "How long until my supplies are ready?" Jack asked. 45 minutes, give or take." "Good. I want to make it to the property before dark." Abernathy nodded slowly, as if he'd expected nothing less. "I'll throw in some extra batteries." "No charge. Something tells me you're going to need them." The last 2 miles took 40 minutes. What the county map had optimistically labeled a forest road was little more than a suggestion carved through thick pines and Douglas fir, the path barely wide enough for Jack's truck. Branches scraped against the sides with a sound like fingernails on metal, and twice he had to stop to move fallen logs that blocked the way. The rain had turned the track into a ribbon of mud that threatened to swallow his tires with every rotation. Ghost stood on the passenger seat, paws braced against the dashboard, his attention focused forward with an intensity that Jack had learned to respect. The dog wasn't afraid. Fear made him whine and pace, but he was alert in a way that suggested he was cataloging threats, measuring distances, preparing for something Jack couldn't yet see. When the cabin finally appeared through a break in the trees, Jack's first thought was that the county assessor's description of poor condition had been generous to the point of dishonesty. The structure was a single-story log construction, probably built in the 30s or 40s, with a sagging roofline and gaps between the logs where the chinking had fallen away. The porch listed to one side, and several of the windows were broken, covered from the inside with what looked like plastic sheeting and duct tape. A rusted metal chimney pipe jutted from the roof at an angle that suggested it had been damaged and never properly repaired. But the bones were solid. Jack could see that even from a distance. The foundation looked intact, the main support beams were still straight, and the roof, though sagging, hadn't collapsed. It was better than some of the places he'd slept during his deployments. It was infinitely better than being in a city where the noise never stopped and every car backfire sent him diving for cover. He parked the truck as close to the porch as he could manage and killed the engine. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the steady drum of rain on the roof and the whisper of wind through the pines. Ghost's ears swiveled, tracking sounds Jack's inferior human hearing couldn't detect. "All right, boy," Jack said, reaching for the door handle. "Let's see what we bought." They approached the cabin together, Jack with his hand resting instinctively on the Glock holstered at his hip. The front door hung slightly ajar, swollen from moisture and jammed in its frame. Jack put his shoulder to it and shoved. It gave way with a groan of protesting wood, swinging inward to reveal a dark interior that smelled of mold, rodent droppings, and something else, something musty and old that Jack couldn't quite identify. He pulled a new flashlight from his belt and swept the beam across the interior. One large main room served as kitchen, dining, and living area. A wood stove sat against the far wall, its pipe disappearing up through the ceiling. To the left, a doorway led to what was probably a bedroom. To the right, a stone fireplace dominated the wall, its hearth made of fitted river stones that had been mortared together with obvious care. Ghost pushed past Jack and into the cabin, his nails clicking on the wooden floorboards. He made a quick circuit of the room, nose to the ground, then stopped at the fireplace and whined. "I know, it's a mess," Jack said, setting his flashlight down and moving to the windows. He needed light and air. The plastic sheeting came down easily, and he cranked open the windows that still had functioning hinges. Fresh air poured in, clean and pine-scented, cutting through the stale atmosphere. Behind him, Ghost whined again, more insistently. Jack turned to find the dog pawing at the stone hearth of the fireplace, his movements deliberate and focused. He'd plant his front paws, scratch at a particular spot, then look back at Jack as if to say, "Pay attention. This is important." "What V you got, Ghost?" Jack crossed to the fireplace, kneeling beside his dog. The hearth was made of smooth river stones, each about the size of a dinner plate, fitted together like a puzzle. Most were mortared solidly in place, but as Jack ran his hands over the surface where Ghost had been scratching, he felt something different. One stone near the right side of the hearth shifted slightly under pressure. Jack pulled out his multi-tool and worked the blade around the edges of the stone. The mortar was old, crumbling easily, and within minutes he'd cleared enough to get his fingers underneath. The stone was heavier than he'd expected, but it lifted free with a grinding sound that seemed loud in the quiet cabin. Beneath it was darkness. Jack grabbed his flashlight and shone into the gap, revealing not earth or foundation, but empty space, a cavity that extended down farther than his flashlight beam could immediately penetrate. Ghost barked once, sharp and urgent, then began pawing at the adjacent stones. "Easy, boy. Let me see what we've got here first." Jack cleared away more mortar, removing 3 more stones until he'd created an opening about 2 feet square. The cavity beneath was definitely man-made, the edges too straight and deliberate to be natural. He leaned in with the flashlight and saw a ladder, wooden rungs attached to what looked like concrete walls, leading down into a chamber below. A root cellar, maybe, or a storm shelter. Plenty of old homesteads had them, places to store food or hide from tornadoes. But something about this felt different. The ladder was too well-maintained, the concrete too recent. And Ghost's agitation was increasing, his entire body quivering with the need to investigate. Jack sat back on his heels, thinking. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it alone, to replace the stones and pretend he'd never found it. But Abernathy's words echoed in his mind. That land knows things. And if you're the curious type, you're going to find them whether you want or not. He was the curious type. That was what had gotten half his squad killed in Kandahar. His curiosity about a compound that intelligence said was empty, but that he knew felt wrong. He'd pushed anyway, and they'd walked into an ambush. 6 men died because Jack Callahan couldn't leave well enough alone. But this wasn't Afghanistan. This was his property, legally purchased. If there was something hidden beneath his cabin, he had a right to know what it was. "Stay," he told Ghost firmly, then swung his legs into the opening. The ladder held his weight, and he descended slowly, testing each rung before committing. The flashlight beam bounced with his movement, creating a dizzying play of light and shadow on the concrete walls. The chamber was about 8 feet deep and 10 feet square. The walls poured concrete and the floor hard-packed earth. But it wasn't empty. Against the far wall sat a green military-grade storage container, the kind designed to survive floods, fires, and small explosions. Beside it were 3 cardboard filing boxes, their tops sealed with duct tape, and a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner. Jack dropped to the floor and approached the containers cautiously. The military box had a combination lock, but someone had already broken the mechanism, recently, from the look of the fresh scratches on the metal. He lifted the lid. Inside were glass jars, dozens of them, each filled with water samples and labeled with dates and locations. Beneath them were manila folders stuffed with documents, photographs, and what looked like laboratory reports. And on top of everything, as if placed there deliberately for whoever found it, was a leather journal bound with a rubber band. Jack lifted the journal out carefully and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and precise, the ink slightly faded but still legible. "My name is Arthur Miller. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. What follows is documentation of corporate malfeasance, environmental crimes, and conspiracy to commit murder. I've hidden this evidence because the local authorities cannot be trusted. The sheriff is compromised. The county prosecutor is on GeoCorp's payroll. Even the state environmental office has been pressured to look the other way. I know they're coming for me. I've known for weeks. I've seen the trucks watching my property receive the anonymous threats, felt the noose tightening. But I won't run, and I won't be silenced. This evidence will survive even if I don't. If you found this, please finish what I started. Contact the EPA directly, bypass local authorities entirely. The people in this valley are being poisoned, and they don't even know it. Someone has to speak for them. Someone has to tell the truth. Jack stood motionless in the underground chamber, the journal trembling slightly in his hands. Above him, Ghost barked urgently, and Jack heard the sound of a vehicle engine approaching through the trees. He shoved the journal into his jacket, grabbed the military container, and climbed the ladder one-handed, his movements fueled by pure adrenaline. He'd barely made it back to the main room when he heard the vehicle stop outside, heard a car door slam. Ghost positioned himself between Jack and the front door, hackles raised, a low growl building in his throat. Jack set the container down behind the wood stove, out of immediate sight, and moved to the window. A sheriff's cruiser sat in his driveway, rain streaming down its windshield. The driver's door was open, but he couldn't see the occupant. Then a figure emerged from behind the truck, tall, thick-bodied, wearing a tan uniform and a wide-brimmed hat that shed water like a roof. Sheriff Riggs had come to welcome him to the neighborhood. Jack took a breath, forced his hands to relax at his sides, and walked to the door. He'd dealt with authority figures his entire adult life. He knew how to be polite, deferential, forgettable. He knew how to lie. He opened the door just as Riggs reached the porch, plastering on a neutral expression. "Afternoon, Sheriff." Riggs was in his 50s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and small eyes that tracked Jack's every movement. "Mr. Callahan, heard you bought the old Miller place. Thought I'd stop by, make sure you're settling in all right." "Appreciate that. Just got here myself." Riggs's gaze moved past Jack into the cabin, lingering on Ghost, on the removed hearthstones, on the open hole in the floor. "Doing some exploring, I see. Found a root cellar. Old properties like this usually have them." "That right." Riggs smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Miller was full of surprises. Never knew what that man was up to. His eyes returned to Jack, hard and assessing. "You planning to stay long?" "Bought the place. Figured I'd stay at least through winter, see how it goes. Winter's rough up here. Man could die. Nobody'd find him till spring thaw." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat, delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Jack met his eyes and held them. "Good thing I've got Ghost. He'd make sure someone knew." For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Riggs stepped back, touching the brim of his hat. "You need anything, you give the department a call. We take care of our residents." "I'll keep that in mind." Riggs returned to his cruiser without another word. Jack watched him execute a careful three-point turn and disappear back down the muddy track, then closed the door and locked it. His hands were shaking. Ghost whined and pressed against his leg, and Jack dropped to one knee, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. "We're in it now, boy," he whispered. "Whatever Miller found, whatever got him killed, we just inherited it." From beneath his jacket, Arthur Miller's journal seemed to burn against his chest, heavy with secrets and death. Jack spent the rest of the afternoon making the cabin habitable, though his mind never left the military container hidden behind the wood stove. He swept out the debris and rodent nests, patched the broken windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape, and set up traps in the corners where he'd seen evidence of mice. He unloaded the supplies from his truck in the fading light, stacking canned goods on makeshift shelves and arranging his sleeping bag near the wood stove. Ghost supervised everything, occasionally returning to the fireplace to sniff at the exposed chamber before looking at Jack with an expression that clearly said they weren't finished with that discovery yet. By the time full darkness fell, Jack had a fire going in the wood stove and 2 kerosene lanterns burning. The cabin was still cold, still damp, still smelling of abandonment, but it was functional. More importantly, it was secure. He'd checked every window, every door, every possible point of entry. Old habits died hard, and in this case, Jack was grateful for them. He heated a can of beef stew on the stovetop, ate it mechanically without tasting, then fed Ghost from the bag of high-quality dog food he bought at Abernathy's. Only when both of them had eaten and the cabin had warmed enough to make his breath stop fogging did Jack finally retrieve the military container and Arthur Miller's journal. He sat on the floor near the wood stove, his back against the wall where he could see both the door and the windows, and opened the journal to the first page. Ghost settled beside him, close enough that Jack could feel the dog's warmth through his jeans. The wind had picked up outside, making the cabin creak and groan like a ship at sea. But inside the circle of lantern light, Jack began to read the last testament of a dead man. Miller's first entries were mundane, almost boring. Observations about cabin life, notes about repairs needed, sketches of the property boundaries. But 3 months in, the tone shifted. Miller had noticed something wrong with the creek that ran through his property. The water had an odd smell, a faint chemical taint that wasn't there when he'd first arrived. Fish that should have been spawning weren't. The vegetation along the banks looked stunted, discolored. October 12th took water samples from 3 locations along Pine Creek, sending them to Bob Chun in Seattle. He's agreed to run analysis, no questions asked. I'm probably being paranoid, but something feels wrong here. The locals don't drink from the creek anymore, I've noticed. They all use well water or drive into town. When I ask why, they just shrug. Always been that way, they say. But it hasn't always been that way. The old maps show Pine Creek as a primary water source for the valley. Jack turned the page, his chest tightening. He knew where this was going, could feel the inevitability of it like watching a car crash in slow motion. November 3rd, Bob got back to me. The results are worse than I imagined. Trichloroethylene, benzene, cadmium, lead, all at levels that are off the charts. This isn't agricultural runoff or natural contamination. This is industrial waste, and it's been dumping into the watershed for years. Decades, maybe. Bob says the concentration suggests a source point somewhere upstream, probably within 5 miles of my property. I need to find it. The next 20 pages detailed Miller's investigation with the thoroughness of a trained journalist. He'd hiked every mile of Pine Creek from his property line up into the high country, documenting his findings with photographs and meticulous notes. He'd found the source 6 miles upstream, an old mining operation that GeoCorp claimed had been decommissioned in 1978. But Miller's photographs showed recent activity, fresh tire tracks, new fencing, and a concrete culvert that was still seeping a dark, oily substance into the creek. Jack set down the journal and dug through the military container until he found the photographs Miller had referenced. Even in the fading Polaroid colors, the evidence was damning. The culvert was clearly modern, installed within the last few decades. The ground around it was stained black, dead vegetation marking the path of contamination like a scar across the landscape. December 15th confronted the county environmental officer today. Showed him the photos, the test results, everything. He barely looked at them. Said GeoCorp had all the proper permits, that the old mine was sealed according to federal standards. When I pressed him, he got angry. Told me I was making serious accusations without understanding the science. But I understand the science perfectly. I understand that people in this valley are getting sick and no one wants to admit why. Ghost shifted beside Jack, raising his head to stare at the door. Jack froze, listening. The wind or something else. After a moment, Ghost relaxed, laying his head back down. False alarm. Jack returned to the journal, turning pages faster now, watching Miller's handwriting become more frantic as the walls closed in. January 8th. Someone broke into my cabin while I was in town. Nothing taken, but everything disturbed. They were looking for something. I've moved the evidence to a safer location. If they want it, they'll have to tear this place apart stone by stone. January 20th, Sheriff Riggs paid me a visit today. Very friendly, very concerned. Asked if I was having any trouble with my property, if anyone was bothering me. Said there'd been reports of trespassing in the area. It felt like a threat wrapped in a welfare check. I told him everything was fine. Elite. February 2nd. Found my dog poisoned this morning. Bella died in my arms. The vet said it looked like antifreeze, but I know better. It was a message. They're telling me they can get to me anytime they want. Jack stopped reading, his throat tight. He reached out and pulled Ghost closer, his hand tangling in the dog's thick fur. Ghost looked up at him with those amber eyes that held more loyalty and understanding than most humans were capable of. February 10th, I've made arrangements. If anything happens to me, Bob Chun will receive copies of everything. I've also contacted someone at the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division, a woman named Sarah Voss who specializes in corporate malfeasance. She's interested, But she needs more than photographs and water samples. She needs financial records, internal communications, something that proved GeoCorp knew about the contamination and covered it up. February 14th, I think I found it. One of GeoCorp's former employees, a man named Dennis Carter who was laid off 6 months ago, reached out after seeing my inquiries. He says he has documents, emails between executives discussing the Pine Creek situation and how to manage the publicity risk. He's scared, wants money for the documents. I don't care about the cost. I'm meeting him tomorrow night at a rest stop off Highway 93. The next entry was dated 3 days later, the handwriting shaky, barely controlled. February 17th, Carter's dead. They're calling it a car accident, single vehicle collision. Driver fell asleep at the wheel. But I was supposed to meet him at that rest stop. He never showed. Now he's dead and the documents are gone. They're cleaning up loose ends. I'm a loose end. February 18th. I've started seeing the same vehicles on the road when I drive to town. A black Suburban with tinted windows. Sometimes it follows me, sometimes it's just parked, watching. They want me to know I'm being monitored. They want me afraid. February 22nd. Last night someone fired a shot near my cabin. Just one, close enough that I heard the bullet hit a tree. Another message. I've fortified the cellar, moved everything underground. If they come for me, at least the evidence will survive. February 28th. This is probably my last entry. I've sent copies of everything to Bob, to Sarah Voss, to 3 different news organizations. But I'm not naive. I know how this works. GeoCorp has lawyers, connections, money. They'll bury the story, discredit me, make it all go away, unless someone finds this cash and has the courage to use it. So if you're reading this, please, don't let them win. Don't let them keep poisoning this valley. People are dying. Children are getting sick. Someone has to stand up. I'm going to call the sheriff now. I'm going to tell him I have proof that I'm ready to share it with federal authorities. It's a bluff. I've already sent everything. But maybe it'll force their hand, make them negotiate. Or maybe it'll just speed up the inevitable. If I disappear, look for me in the high country. If I had to run, that's where I'd go. Arthur Miller. The journal ended there. Jack sat in silence, the words echoing in his mind. He flipped through the remaining pages, all blank, then set the journal aside and picked up the folders from the military container. Laboratory reports confirmed Miller's water samples showed contamination levels that were literally off the charts. Photographs documented the source. And in the bottom of the container, wrapped in plastic, was a thick manila envelope labeled Carter documents. Jack opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of internal GeoCorp emails, memoranda between executives, and financial records. He wasn't an accountant, but even he could see what Miller had found. GeoCorp had known about the contamination since at least 1995. They conducted their own testing, determined that remediation would cost between $40 and $60 million, and decided instead to conceal the problem. They'd bribed local officials, intimidated potential whistleblowers, and created a network of plausible deniability that reached all the way to the state environmental office. And when Arthur Miller had threatened to expose them, they'd made him disappear. Jack leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. He'd wanted isolation, wanted escape, wanted a place where the ghosts of his past couldn't follow him. Instead, he'd walked into someone else's war, inherited someone else's fight. The irony wasn't lost on him. Ghost nudged his hand, and Jack opened his eyes to find the dog watching him with an expression that might have been concern. "I know what you're thinking," Jack said quietly. "You're thinking this is none of our business. We should pack up, walk away, let someone else deal with it." Ghost's tail thumped once against the floor. No, that wasn't what he was thinking at all. Jack pulled out his phone, checked for signal. One bar, barely enough. He thought about calling Bob Chun, about reaching out to this Sarah Voss at the EPA, but Abernathy's warning echoed in his mind. The sheriff was compromised. Local authorities couldn't be trusted. Who else might be listening? Who else might be watching? He needed time. Time to read through everything, to understand the full scope of what Miller had uncovered, to make a plan that wouldn't get him killed in the first week. Miller had been impulsive, had confronted people directly, had given them warning. Jack wouldn't make the same mistakes. He'd spent 20 years in the army learning how to survive against superior numbers and resources. He knew how to be patient, how to gather intelligence, how to wait for the right moment to strike. GeoCorp thought they'd buried this secret with Arthur Miller. They thought 15 years and a few ghost stories would be enough to keep people away. They were wrong. Jack gathered the documents carefully, returned them to the military container, and carried it down into the cellar. He'd reinforce the hiding place, make it harder to find, and then he'd start planning. Not revenge. He wasn't interested in revenge, but justice, accountability, the thing he'd fought for in every war zone he'd ever deployed to. As he climbed back up the ladder, Ghost waiting at the top, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Purpose, direction, a mission that mattered. Arthur Miller had started this fight alone and lost. But Jack Callahan wasn't alone. He had Ghost, he had 20 years of combat experience, and he had nothing left to lose. GeoCorp was about to learn that some veterans didn't stay buried. Jack woke to Ghost's low growl and the sound of an engine approaching up the mountain road. He was on his feet before his eyes fully opened, the Glock already in his hand, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. Dawn light filtered through the cabin's windows, gray and weak, illuminating his breath in the cold air. The fire had died during the night, and frost had formed on the inside of the glass. He moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the plastic sheeting. A sheriff's cruiser was grinding up the muddy track, taking the turns carefully, in no particular hurry. Jack checked his watch. 6:45 in the morning. Early for a social call. Easy, Ghost, he murmured, though the dog's hackles remained raised, his body tense and ready. Jack holstered the Glock and pulled on his boots, then his jacket. Whatever was about to happen, he needed to appear calm, unremarkable, like a man who had nothing to hide. By the time Sheriff Riggs's cruiser pulled to a stop in front of the cabin, Jack was standing on the porch with a steaming cup of instant coffee, the picture of a peaceful morning. Ghost sat beside him, alert but controlled, waiting for Jack's signal. Riggs took his time getting out of the vehicle, adjusting his hat and his gun belt with the deliberate movements of a man establishing dominance through patience. He was alone, Jack noted. No backup, no weakness. That told Jack everything he needed to know about the nature of this visit. Mr. Callahan, Riggs called out, his breath fogging in the cold air. Early riser, I see. Old habit, Jack replied, keeping his tone neutral. Coffee. Don't mind if I do. Riggs climbed the porch steps, his boots heavy on the weathered wood. Up close, Jack could see the broken capillaries across the sheriff's nose, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested either too much coffee or not enough whiskey. Cold night. Fire went out around 3. I'll get better at keeping it going. Jack disappeared inside long enough to pour a second cup of instant coffee, adding powdered creamer and too much sugar the way he'd seen Riggs take it at the courthouse. When he returned to the porch, the sheriff was examining the property with an appraiser's eye. Property's in rougher shape than I remember, Riggs said, accepting the coffee. Haven't been up here in years, though. Not since we searched the place after Miller disappeared. Find anything? Jack kept his voice casual, just making conversation. Not much. Man just vanished. Happens sometimes in these mountains. People think they want isolation until they get it. Then the silence drives them crazy. Riggs sipped his coffee, watching Jack over the rim. You ever get lonely, Mr. Callahan? I've got Ghost. That's company enough. That's right. You're ex-military. Army, wasn't it? Riggs didn't wait for confirmation. See a lot of combat. Enough. Must be hard coming back to civilian life. All that training, all that purpose, then suddenly you're just another citizen with nothing to do. Riggs's tone was sympathetic, but his eyes were cold, calculating. Some guys, they can't adjust. They do things they shouldn't. Make trouble where there isn't any. Jack met his gaze steadily. I'm just looking to live quiet, Sheriff. Fix up the cabin. Maybe do some hunting, keep to myself. That's good to hear, because we've had problems in the past with this property. Miller, he got some strange ideas in his head. Started seeing conspiracies where there weren't any, making accusations against good people. Riggs set his coffee cup down on the porch railing with a soft clink. It got so bad, we started to worry about his mental state. Man was clearly disturbed. That why he disappeared? That's our theory. Walked off into the woods, Probably had some kind of breakdown. We searched for weeks, but these mountains are unforgiving. If a man doesn't want to be found. Riggs shrugged. Anyway, I wanted to come by, make sure you understood the situation. This property has a history. People in town, they talk. Some of them might try to tell you stories about Miller, about GeoCorp, about all kinds of nonsense. I appreciate the warning. Jack picked up his own coffee, using the movement to create distance between them. Ghost shifted position, maintaining his place between Jack and the sheriff. Smart dog, Riggs observed. Protective. That's good. Man living alone needs a good dog. Though I hope you're not the paranoid type. Hope you're not going to see threats where there aren't any. I just see a sheriff making a welfare check. Nothing threatening about that. Riggs smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're a smart man, Mr. Callahan. I can tell. Smart enough to know when something's none of your business. Smart enough to understand that sometimes the best thing a newcomer can do is keep his head down and his mouth shut. The threat was so naked now that Jack almost admired it. No more pretense, no more friendly small talk. Just one powerful man telling another, less powerful man to know his place. Jack had seen it 100 times in the military. Colonels reminding captains who really ran things, sergeants major putting lieutenants in their place. The difference was, Jack didn't work for Sheriff Riggs. I'll keep that in mind, Jack said evenly. You do that. Riggs stepped off the porch, then paused and turned back. Oh, one more thing. You planning to do any exploring on your property? Any hiking up into the high country? Might eventually. What? Just be careful. Easy to get lost up there, especially for someone who doesn't know the terrain. And we're coming into bear season. Grizzlies get aggressive this time of year, storing up food before they den. A man alone, even with a dog, well, accidents happen. Riggs touched the brim of his hat in a mock salute. You take care now, Mr. Callahan. And if you find anything interesting on your property, anything at all, you give me a call before you do anything stupid with it. Sometimes things are better left buried. Jack watched him return to his cruiser, every muscle in his body coiled tight. The message couldn't have been clearer. They knew he'd found something. Maybe they didn't know exactly what, but they suspected, and they were willing to kill him to keep it hidden, just like they'd killed Miller. The cruiser's engine turned over, and Riggs began the careful process of turning around in the narrow clearing. Jack stayed on the porch, coffee cup in hand, playing the role of the unconcerned property owner watching a neighbor leave. Only when the cruiser disappeared down the track did he allow himself to move. Stay, he told Ghost, then jogged to where his truck was parked. Something had been nagging at him, some instinct that had nothing to do with Riggs's words and everything to do with the way the sheriff had walked around the vehicle when he'd arrived, the way his hand had trailed along the side, as if steadying himself. Jack circled his truck, checking the body, the windows, the bed. Everything looked normal until he reached the rear passenger side. The tire was flat, completely deflated, and when he crouched down to examine it, he found a neat 2-inch slash in the sidewall. Fresh, the rubber still showing clean edges. It hadn't been there yesterday. Ghost appeared at his side, whining softly. Jack reached out to touch the slashed tire, his hand shaking with suppressed rage. It was such a petty thing, such a small act of vandalism, but the message was enormous. We can get to you anytime. We can damage your property, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're alone here, and we own this valley. Jack stood slowly, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He looked down the empty road where Riggs had disappeared, then back at the cabin where Miller's evidence was hidden beneath innocent-looking hearthstones. The smart play was to walk away. Pack up, drive out on his spare tire, never look back. Let someone else fight this fight. But Jack Callahan had spent 2 years walking away from fights. Walking away from his unit when they forced him into medical retirement. Walking away from his home because the memories were too heavy. Walking away from anything that might require him to care, to engage, to risk himself for something larger than his own survival. He was done walking away. He pulled out his phone, checked for signal. Still only 1 bar, but it might be enough. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Abernathy's general store, dialed, and waited through 4 rings before the old man's gravelly voice answered. Abernathy's. Bill, it's Jack Callahan. I need a favor. There was a pause, and Jack could almost hear the man thinking, weighing risks. What kind of favor? The kind that involved a slashed tire and a sheriff who thinks I'm stupid enough to be intimidated. Jack kept his voice low, controlled. I need you to order me a replacement tire, have it delivered to your store. I'll pick it up tomorrow. And I need you to recommend someone trustworthy, someone not on GeoCorp's payroll, who can help me get digital copies of some documents to a secure location. Another pause, longer this time. When Abernathy spoke again, his voice had changed, become harder, more focused. You found something. I found everything. Miller's journals, his evidence, all of it. And now they know I found it. Jésus Christ, son. I need to finish what Miller started, Jack interrupted. But I'm going to do it smarter than he did. I'm not confronting anyone. I'm not making threats. I'm not giving them a chance to make me disappear. I'm just going to quietly make copies and get them to people who can use them. The FBI. You need to call the FBI. Eventually. But first, I need to make sure the evidence survives even if I don't. Miller tried to send copies out, but they still managed to bury the story. I need a dead man switch, something that automatically goes public if anything happens to me. Jack watched Ghost, who was staring down the road, ears pricked forward. Can you help me or not? The silence stretched so long Jack thought the call had dropped. Then Abernathy sighed, a sound like whined through old trees. I've got a nephew in Kalispell. He's a computer guy, works in cybersecurity. If anyone can set up what you're talking about, it's him. But Jack, this is dangerous. If Riggs knows you found something, he's not going to wait long to act. I know. That's why I need to move fast. Jack headed back to the cabin, his mind already racing through logistics, timelines, contingencies. Can you call your nephew? Tell him I'll be there tomorrow afternoon. I'll call him. But promise me something. Promise me you'll be careful. Miller thought he was careful too, and look what happened to him. Miller was alone. I've got Ghost, and I got 20 years of experience staying alive in hostile territory. I'll be fine. He ended the call before Abernathy could argue further and stood on the porch, looking out at his property. 160 acres of poison land, bought for $500. The worst investment he'd ever made, and somehow the most important. Ghost pressed against his leg, solid and warm and loyal. Jack scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the steady thump of his heartbeat. We're going to see this through, he said quietly. Whatever it takes. For Miller, for the people in this valley, for everyone GeoCorp has hurt. We're going to make sure the truth comes out. Ghost looked up at him with those amber eyes that saw everything, understood everything, and his tail wagged once in agreement. They had work to do. Jack spent the morning changing his tire, working in the cold mountain air, while Ghost patrolled the perimeter of the property. The spare was old but functional, and Jack took his time with the job, using the physical labor to think through his next moves. He needed to photograph every document in Miller's cache, create multiple backup copies, establish secure cloud storage that couldn't be traced back to him. Abernathy's nephew would know how to handle the technical details, but Jack needed to understand the operational security himself. In hostile territory, you never relied entirely on local assets, no matter how trustworthy they seemed. He was tightening the last lug nut when he heard the vehicle. Not the rough growl of Riggs's cruiser, but something smoother, more expensive. A black Suburban with tinted windows emerged from the tree line, moving slowly up the rutted track as if the driver was concerned about damaging the suspension. Ghost materialized from the woods and took up position beside Jack, his posture alert but not aggressive. Whoever this was, they were different from Riggs. Different threat profile. The Suburban stopped 20 feet from Jack's truck, engine idling for a long moment before shutting off. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out, and Jack understood immediately that this was the real power behind everything that had happened to Arthur Miller. This was the man who gave orders to sheriffs and decided who disappeared. Silas Blackwood was in his early 60s, tall and trim with silver hair styled in a way that probably cost more than Jack's monthly disability check. He wore dark slacks and a cashmere sweater under a wool overcoat that looked like it had been tailored in Manhattan. His shoes were leather, polished, completely inappropriate for mountain mud. But he moved with the confidence of a man who'd never encountered a problem money couldn't solve, never faced consequences for his actions. Mr. Callahan, Blackwood said, his voice smooth and cultured. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I am Silas Blackwood. I own GeoCorp, among other interests in the valley. Jack straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't offer to shake hands, didn't move closer. Long way to drive for a social call. Indeed it is. Blackwood smiled, but his eyes were appraising Jack the way a predator might study potential prey. Beautiful property, though. I can see why Miller fell in love with it. The isolation, the views, the sense of complete autonomy. It's intoxicating for a certain type of man. What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood? Direct. I appreciate that. Blackwood glanced at the cabin, at the repaired windows, and the smoke rising from the chimney. You've been busy, making the place livable. That suggests you're planning to stay. That was the idea when I bought it. Of course, though I imagine you're discovering that mountain living isn't quite as romantic as it seems. The isolation can be oppressive, especially as winter sets in. And this property in particular has certain complications. Blackwood stepped closer, his movements casual but purposeful. I'm here to make you an offer that I think you'll find quite generous. Jack said nothing, just waited. He'd conducted enough interrogations to know that silence was a weapon, that people would fill gaps in conversation with more information than questions would ever extract. I'm prepared to purchase this property from you for $50,000, Blackwood continued. That's a substantial return on your $500 investment, and considerably more than the land is actually worth given its condition and history. You'd walk away with enough money to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere more suitable for a man seeking peace and quiet. Property's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Mr. Callahan. It's just a matter of finding the right price. Blackwood's smile widened, showing too many teeth. Perhaps $50,000 seems insufficient. I could go as high as $75,000. Cash, naturally. No paperwork, no questions asked. You could be gone by tomorrow morning with enough money to disappear anywhere in the country. Jack set down the tire iron he'd been holding, making sure his hands were empty and visible. I said it's not for sale. I appreciate the offer, but I'm staying. For the first time, something cold flickered across Blackwood's expression. May I ask why? You've been here less than 48 hours. You know nothing about this valley, nothing about the complexities of living in such an isolated location. What possible reason could you have for turning down such a generous offer? I bought this land legally. I own it, and I'm not interested in selling. Not to you or anyone else. Jack kept his voice level, reasonable. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do. Blackwood didn't move. I see. Perhaps I haven't been clear about the situation. This valley has a delicate balance, Mr. Callahan. GeoCorp employs over 300 people locally. We contribute millions to the regional economy. We sponsor schools, fund hospitals, support community programs. We're not some faceless corporation. We're part of the fabric of this community. I'm sure the people drinking poison water appreciate your contributions. The words were out before Jack could stop them, and he saw Blackwood's expression freeze, saw the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. Ghost shifted beside him, sensing the change in atmosphere, the sudden spike of danger. I see, Blackwood said softly. Sheriff Riggs was right. You have been exploring the property, finding things that don't concern you. Anything on my land concerns me. That's where you're mistaken. Some things are bigger than property rights, bigger than individual curiosity. Blackwood's voice had lost its warmth, become something sharp and lethal. Arthur Miller made the same mistake you're making. He thought finding some old water samples and conspiracy theories made him righteous, made him a crusader for truth. Do you know what it actually made him? Dead. Dead, Blackwood agreed. Though officially, he simply disappeared, walked off into the woods, probably suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. That's what the official record says, and that's what it will always say. Because no one could prove otherwise. No body, no evidence, no case. Jack felt his pulse accelerate, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before combat. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was a death threat, delivered with the casual certainty of a man who'd given such threats before and watched them carried out. I'm going to say this once, Blackwood continued, stepping closer despite Ghost's warning growl. You have something that belongs to me. Documents, evidence, research that Miller compiled through illegal trespass on GeoCorp property. That information is company proprietary, and I want it returned. If you cooperate, if you hand over everything Miller hid and leave the valley voluntarily, I'm prepared to let you walk away. $75,000 in your life. That's the offer. And if I refuse, then you'll suffer the same fate as Miller. It won't be quick and it won't be clean, but it will be thorough. You'll disappear, and your dog will be found wandering the property, and eventually someone else will buy this land at auction. Blackwood's smile returned, colder than the mountain air. The difference is Miller had friends who asked questions, who pushed for investigations. You're a veteran with PTSD and a history of isolation. When you disappear, people will assume you finally snapped. It's actually a perfect cover story. Jack's hand moved toward his hip, toward the Glock, but Blackwood was already stepping back toward his Suburban, his confidence absolute. You have 24 hours to decide, Blackwood called over his shoulder. After that, the offer expires and other measures will be taken. I suggest you choose wisely, Mr. Callahan. Your life depends on it. He climbed into the Suburban, and the engine purred to life. The vehicle executed a smooth three-point turn and disappeared down the track, leaving Jack standing in the muddy clearing with Ghost pressed against his leg and rage burning in his chest. 24 hours. Blackwood had given him 24 hours, probably assuming Jack would spend that time panicking, second-guessing himself, ultimately breaking under the weight of fear and self-preservation. It was a calculated move, a psychological operation designed to isolate and intimidate. But Blackwood had made a crucial mistake. He'd assumed Jack was like Miller, alone, inexperienced in warfare, vulnerable. He hadn't bothered to learn that Jack had spent 20 years in hostile territories, surrounded by enemies, learning to survive when survival seemed impossible. He hadn't understood that for men like Jack, threats didn't inspire fear. They inspired planning. Jack pulled out his phone and dialed Abernathy's store. The old man answered on the second ring. Your nephew available today instead of tomorrow? Jack asked without preamble. What happened? Silas Blackwood just offered me $75,000 to leave, then threatened to kill me when I refused. I'm guessing I've got less than 24 hours before they make their move. Jack was already heading into the cabin, his mind racing through contingencies. I need to digitize everything today, set up the dead man's switch, and get copies to multiple locations. Can your nephew meet me in 3 hours? Jack, if Blackwood threatened you directly, you need to call the FBI right now. That's felony intimidation at minimum. And who would I tell them threatened me? A respected businessman who'll deny everything and have a dozen witnesses place him somewhere else? I need evidence first, leverage. Then I'll call the FBI. Jack was pulling Miller's journals from their hiding place, spreading them across the floor. 3 hours, Bill. Can he meet me or not? There was a long pause, then Abernathy sighed. He'll meet you. Coffee shop on Main Street in Kalispell, place called Mountain Grounds. He's expecting you at 2 o'clock. His name's Ryan. He'll be wearing a red North Face jacket. And Jack, be careful. If Blackwood gave you 24 hours, he's using that time to set up whatever they've got planned. You're not going to catch them off guard. I'm counting on them being predictable, Jack said. They made Miller disappear. They'll try to do the same to me. But Miller was a journalist. I'm a ranger. We're going to learn the difference. He ended the call and spent the next hour photographing every page of Miller's journals with his phone, every document in the military container, every photograph. He worked methodically, making sure each image was clear and legible, organizing them into folders by date and subject. Ghost watched from the doorway, his body tense, sensing Jack's urgency. When the photographs were complete, Jack packed the originals back into the container and returned them to the cellar. Then he loaded his Glock, checked his spare magazines, and pulled on his jacket. The Remington .30-06 that Abernathy had sold him was already loaded and leaning against the wall near the door. Come on, Ghost, he said, moving toward his truck. We've got an appointment in Kalispell, and then we're going to make sure Silas Blackwood regrets ever threatening us. Ghost jumped into the passenger seat, and Jack started the engine. As they pulled out of the clearing, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin. His cabin, bought legally, owned rightfully. Whatever happened next, he wasn't running. He wasn't disappearing. He was fighting back. Jack returned to the cabin just after sunset, his truck loaded with supplies from Kalispell, and his phone now containing multiple encrypted backups of Miller's evidence. Ryan Abernathy had been efficient, professional, and appropriately paranoid. Within 2 hours, he'd set up cloud storage across 3 different services, established a dead man switch that would automatically send the evidence to 6 major news outlets and the FBI if Jack didn't check in every 12 hours, and created a backup protocol that even Jack barely understood but trusted completely. The kid had asked only one question. "Are you sure you want to go back there?" Jack's answer had been simple. "It's my home." Now, as he unpacked the truck in the gathering darkness, that decision felt both foolish and inevitable. The cabin sat in its clearing like a target, surrounded by dense forest that could hide an army. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. Cell service was intermittent at best. If Blackwood's people came for him tonight, no one would hear the gunfire. No one would find him until spring thaw. But Jack had faced worse odds in places where he didn't speak the language and couldn't tell enemy from civilian. At least here, the sides were clear. He'd spent the drive back planning his defensive strategy. The cabin had only 2 entrances, front door and back door, and 4 windows. He'd already reinforced the doors with the 2x4s he'd bought in Kalispell, creating makeshift barricades that could be deployed in seconds. The windows were the vulnerability, but he'd positioned furniture to create cover and firing positions. It wasn't Fort Benning, but it would have to do. Ghost helped him carry supplies inside, his behavior throughout the day growing increasingly agitated. The dog knew something was coming. Animals always knew. By 9 o'clock, Jack had the cabin as secure as he could make it. Fire burning in the wood stove, lanterns lit and positioned to create maximum visibility inside, while limiting what could be seen from outside, weapons loaded and staged at multiple locations. The Glock on his hip, the Remington near the front door, a hunting knife on the counter. He'd even rigged a crude early warning system using fishing line and empty cans around the perimeter. Low tech, but effective. He ate cold beef stew straight from the can, feeding Ghost a double portion of kibble. The door handle turned. The door pushed inward an inch, 2 inches blocked by the 2x4 barricade. Someone swore softly on the other side. Then the door slammed open with sudden violence, the barricade splintering, and a figure in dark clothing pushed through with a shotgun raised. Ghost moved like a missile, 80 pounds of trained aggression hitting the intruder center mass. The man went down with a scream that was cut short by Ghost's jaws clamping on his gun arm. The shotgun clattered to the floor, and Jack was already moving, grabbing the weapon and kicking it away. "Ghost out," Jack commanded, and the dog released immediately, backing away but maintaining his aggressive posture. Jack had the Glock out now, pointed at the intruder's face. "Don't move. Don't even breathe hard." The man was young, maybe 30, with the soft physique of someone who'd never done real physical labor. His arm was bleeding where Ghost had torn through his jacket, his face pale with shock and pain. Not a professional. Definitely local muscle. "How many?" Jack demanded. Fuck you." Jack shifted his aim and fired a single shot into the floorboards 6 inches from the man's head. The report was deafening in the enclosed space, and the intruder flinched violently, his hands coming up in surrender. "How many?" Jack repeated, his voice flat and cold. "3. 3 of us." "Jesus Christ, don't shoot me." "Where are the other 2? "Front and side." "There." The front window shattered inward, glass exploding across the cabin floor. Jack threw himself behind the overturned table he'd positioned for exactly this purpose, heard the bark of a rifle, felt the impact of rounds hitting the table and the wall behind him. Ghost was already moving, low and fast, disappearing into the shadows. Jack came up with a Remington, acquired the target through the broken window, a figure in the clearing, silhouetted against the trees, and fired. The rifle's report was enormous, the recoil solid and familiar against his shoulder. The figure dropped, whether hit or taking cover, Jack couldn't tell. Movement at the side window. Jack spun, fired again, saw the window frame splinter. Someone screamed. Then silence, broken only by the ringing in Jack's ears and the sound of his own controlled breathing. The intruder on the floor was crawling toward the back door, leaving a trail of blood. Jack let him go. He was no longer a threat, and Jack needed to focus on the immediate dangers. He moved to the front window, staying low, scanning the clearing. The figure he'd shot was gone, retreated or wounded, either way not visible. "Ghost," Jack called softly. A moment later, the dog appeared from the bedroom, unharmed. Jack felt a wave of relief, so intense it was almost painful. Whatever else happened tonight, Ghost was safe. Minutes passed. Jack maintained his position, rifle ready, waiting for another assault. But none came. The attackers had broken contact, retreated to regroup or to tend their wounded. Smart from their perspective. They'd underestimated their target, taken casualties, lost the element of surprise. Jack waited 10 more minutes before moving, then did a quick survey of the cabin. 2 windows broken, multiple bullet holes in the walls and furniture, blood on the floor near the back door. The damage was significant but manageable. More importantly, the original evidence was still secure in the cellar, untouched. He grabbed his phone, checked the time. 12:15. He triggered the check-in for Ryan's dead man switch, then composed a text message to Abernathy. They came. 3 men. 1 injured badly, others retreated. "I'm okay, Ghost is okay." This was the opening move. "Main assault coming soon." The response came back within seconds. "Get out. Drive to town. I'll meet you." Jack looked around the cabin, at the shattered windows and bullet-scarred walls, then typed his reply. "No. If I run now, they win. I am staying. But tell your nephew to reduce the check-in window to 6 hours. If they're escalating this fast, I need a tighter safety net." He didn't wait for Abernathy's response. He was already moving through the cabin, assessing damage, planning repairs, reinforcing weak points. The assault tonight had been a probe, testing his defenses and his resolve. They'd expected to find a scared civilian, easy prey. Instead, they'd found a soldier who knew how to fight. But Jack wasn't naive. Tonight had been 3 men, local muscle, poorly trained. Next time would be different. Next time they'd send professionals, men who knew what they were doing, who wouldn't make the same mistakes. He had maybe 12 hours before the next assault. Maybe less. Jack spent those hours turning his cabin into a fortress. He boarded up the broken windows with plywood, creating gun ports that allowed him to fire out while limiting incoming fire. He moved his truck behind the cabin, using it as additional cover and ensuring they couldn't disable his escape route. He distributed ammunition throughout the cabin, creating caches he could access from any position. And he ran through scenarios in his mind, wargaming every possible approach, every tactical option his enemies might employ. Ghost stayed close, sleeping in short bursts, always alert. Jack envied the dog's ability to rest when opportunities presented themselves. His own sleep had been fitful and haunted for years, and tonight was no exception. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his squad in Kandahar, saw the ambush unfolding, saw the decisions that had led to their deaths. But this was different. This time he wasn't making decisions for a squad. This time it was just him and Ghost, and the stakes were clear. Survive long enough for the evidence to matter. Make sure Miller's death meant something. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the boarded windows. Jack made coffee on the stove, fed Ghost, and did a perimeter check. No signs of surveillance, no vehicles on the approach road. But they were out there, watching, planning. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Callahan, this is Sarah Voss, EPA Criminal Investigation Division. I received your package. We need to talk immediately. Please call this number." Jack stared at the message, his mind racing. Ryan must have automatically sent copies to the EPA as part of the backup protocol, which meant the evidence was now in federal hands, which meant the clock was running for Blackwood and his people. They'd come today. They had to, before the evidence could be corroborated and acted upon, before the FBI could get involved, before their window closed completely. Jack typed a quick response to Voss. "Under threat. Armed assault last night. Multiple attackers. Evidence is authentic. We'll call when secure." Then he set the phone aside, picked up the Remington, and took up position near the front window. Ghost settled beside him, both of them watching the tree line, waiting for what they knew was coming. The final battle for Miller's legacy had begun. The weather forecast came through on Jack's phone at 0700. Major winter storm system moving in from the northwest, expected to hit the valley by 1800 hours. Heavy snow, high winds, temperatures dropping into the single digits. The kind of storm that shut down roads and isolated anyone foolish enough to be caught on the mountain. Jack stared at the alert, his tactical mind immediately recognizing the problem. Blackwood's people would use the storm as cover for their final assault. No witnesses, no chance of interference, no way for Jack to escape or call for help. They'd wait until the roads were impassable, then come in force. And if Jack was still at the cabin when that happened, fortifications or not, he'd be overwhelmed. But the storm also represented an opportunity. If Jack could get off the mountain before the weather hit, if he could get the evidence to someone Blackwood couldn't touch, then even if they killed him later, Miller's work would survive. The dead man switch Ryan had set up was solid, but it relied on digital systems that could potentially be hacked or disrupted. Jack needed a physical backup, a person who could take the evidence and run with it if necessary. He needed Mark Shen. Mark had been Jack's spotter in Afghanistan, the calm voice in his ear during missions when split-second decisions meant life or death. After the ambush that killed half their squad, Mark had been medically discharged with injuries that ended his military career, but not his instinct for survival. He'd gone home to Seattle, gotten a job with a tech company, stayed in touch. When Jack had called him yesterday from a gas station payphone, the only truly secure communication he could manage, Mark had listened to the whole story without interrupting, then said exactly what Jack needed to hear. "I've got your six, brother. Whatever you need." Jack parked in the back lot where his truck wouldn't be visible from the street, checked his surroundings one more time, then headed inside with Ghost at his heel. The diner was nearly empty, just an elderly waitress wiping down tables and a cook visible through the service window. And in a corner booth near the emergency exit sat Mark Shin. He looked older than Jack remembered, which made sense given they hadn't seen each other in person for 3 years. His black hair was cut military short, and he wore wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a programmer than the sniper he'd been. But when his eyes found Jack, there was no mistaking the recognition, the instant assessment of threat level, the muscle memory of partnership. Jack slid into the booth across from him, Ghost settling underneath the table. "Thanks for coming. You sounded like you needed backup. I don't ignore that." Mark's voice was quiet, controlled. "Though I gotta say, the whole story sounds insane. Corporate conspiracy, murdered journalists, corrupt sheriffs. It's like something out of a movie. It's real. All of it." Jack pulled out one of the flash drives and slid it across the table. "That's everything. Miller's journals, laboratory reports, photographs, financial documents. Enough to put Silas Blackwood and half the county officials in prison for decades." Mark pocketed the drive without looking at it. "What's the protocol? If I don't call you by 0600 tomorrow morning, you take that straight to the FBI. Not local field office, Seattle. Tell them it's evidence of ongoing environmental crimes, conspiracy to commit murder, and corruption of public officials. They'll have to investigate. And if you do call, then I'm still alive and fighting. You hold on to the evidence until I say otherwise." Jack accepted a coffee from the waitress, waited until she moved away, then continued in a low voice. "Mark, if something happens to me, if they do what they did to Miller, I'll finish it," Mark interrupted. "I'll make sure everyone knows what they did, what they've been doing to that valley. You got my word on that." They sat in silence for a moment, two soldiers who'd survived hell together, now facing different kinds of war. Then Mark leaned forward, his expression serious. "Jack, why are you going back? You've got the evidence secured. You've got backup protocols in place. Why not just stay in town until the FBI moves?" "Because it's my home. Because if I run now, they'll just burn it down and destroy any physical evidence I left behind. Because someone needs to stand on that land and tell them no." Jack met his friend's eyes. "And because I'm tired of running. I've been running for 2 years from the memories, from the guilt, from everything that happened in Kandahar. This is the first place that's felt like it matters since I left the service. I'm not giving it up without a fight. Mark nodded slowly, understanding in a way few civilians could. Then make sure you win. Because if I have to deliver that evidence to the FBI, I'm also telling them you died defending the truth. And you deserve a better ending than that. I'll do my best. Jack stood, and Mark stood with him. They shook hands, the grip firm and familiar. Take care of yourself, Mark. And thank you. Call me at 0600. I'll be waiting. Jack left the diner with Ghost, returned to his truck, and headed back toward the highway. The wind had picked up significantly, and the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. Light scattered, but a warning of what was coming. He had maybe 6 hours before the storm made the mountain road impassable. He stopped at a hardware store and bought more plywood, nails, and 2 heavy-duty chains with padlocks. If they were going to burn his cabin down, they'd have to work for it. Then he hit a sporting goods store and bought every box of .30-06 ammunition they had in stock, plus a tactical vest and a pair of night vision goggles that cost more than he'd wanted to spend but would be worth every penny when the assault came in darkness. By 1400 hours, he was heading back up Highway 93 with the sky darkening overhead and snow falling steadily. The weather forecast had been updated. The storm was moving faster than expected, intensifying as it hit the mountains. Blizzard conditions by 1600 hours. Jack pressed harder on the accelerator, racing against time and weather. He made it to his access road at 1530, the truck's four-wheel drive engaging automatically as he navigated the increasingly treacherous track. Snow was already accumulating, turning the mud into slick ice beneath a white coating. Visibility was dropping by the minute, the forest disappearing into a wall of white. The cabin appeared through the snow like a ghost, dark and silent. Jack parked behind it, killed the engine, and sat for a moment listening to the wind howl through the trees. Ghost whined softly, sensing the tension, the approaching violence. "I know, boy," Jack murmured, "but we're home now. This is where we make our stand." They unloaded the supplies quickly, fighting the wind and snow. Jack spent the next hour reinforcing his fortifications, adding the chains across the doors as additional barriers, boarding up the remaining vulnerable points, distributing the new ammunition to his weapons caches. He activated the night vision goggles, tested their range and clarity, then positioned them near his primary fighting position. By 1700 hours, the blizzard was in full force. Snow fell so heavily Jack could barely see 20 feet beyond the cabin. The wind screamed like something alive, rattling the boards and threatening to tear away anything not secured. Temperature had dropped to 15 degrees and was still falling. Perfect conditions for an assault. The noise of the storm would cover their approach. The visibility would hide their numbers until they were on top of him. The cold would sap his endurance if the fight went long. But it would also slow them down, make coordination difficult, turn their advantage in numbers into a liability as they struggled through deep snow and whiteout conditions. Jack had fought in blizzards before, had learned how to use the weather as a weapon rather than an obstacle. He made one final check of his defenses, fed Ghost a full meal, then settled into position with the Remington and his phone. He set an alarm for 0530, 30 minutes before his scheduled call to Mark. If he was still alive and free at that time, he'd make the call and buy himself another day. If not, Mark would do what needed to be done. At 1800 hours, Jack sent a final text to Sarah Voss at the EPA, storm moving in. Final assault likely tonight. If I don't respond by morning, evidence is already with FBI Seattle. Miller's work will not be buried. Neither will I. Then he turned off all the lights, pulled on the night vision goggles, and waited in the darkness while the storm raged outside and Ghost pressed close against his leg, both of them ready for whatever came through that wall of white. The evidence was secure. The backup was in place. The protocol was set. Now it was just a matter of surviving until dawn. They came at 2200 hours, materializing from the blizzard like wraiths. Through the night vision goggles, Jack counted 6 figures moving in tactical formation, 2 approaching from the front, 2 from the rear, 2 flanking from the sides. These weren't local muscle like the previous night. These men moved with purpose and training, weapons held ready, communication coordinated through hand signals. Mercenaries, profissionals. Blackwood had brought in specialists to finish what the amateurs couldn't. Jack's heart rate remained steady, his breathing controlled. This was what he'd trained for, what he'd spent 20 years preparing to face. 6 against 1 were bad odds, but he had advantages they didn't expect. He knew the terrain. He'd prepared the battle space. And he had Ghost, worth at least 2 men in any fight. The first pair reached the front porch, stacked on either side of the door with the precision of military entry teams. Jack watched through a gun port he'd cut in the plywood, the Remington scope lined up on the lead man's center mass. He waited until both figures were committed to the breach, then squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was massive even through the storm's howl. The lead man dropped, and Jack was already working the bolt, acquiring the second target, firing again. The second figure stumbled backward off the porch. Whether hit or seeking cover, Jack couldn't tell. But the element of surprise was gone. The assault had begun. Gunfire erupted from 3 sides simultaneously, rounds punching through the plywood and the cabin walls. Jack dropped below the window line, rolled to his secondary position near the back door. Ghost was already there, pressed against the wall, waiting. The tactical vest Jack had bought was proving its worth. He could feel the weight of the extra magazines, the solid comfort of being prepared. The back door exploded inward, the chain snapping under coordinated force. 2 figures burst through, assault rifles sweeping the interior. Ghost launched himself at the nearest one with a snarl that could be heard even over the gunfire. The man went down screaming, and Jack put 2 rounds from the Glock into the second figure before he could bring his weapon to bear. But they kept coming. The side window shattered, someone trying to climb through. Jack fired twice, heard a grunt of pain, saw the figure fall back. Then movement at the front door, the barricade giving way, another mercenary pushing through with a shotgun. Jack took the shot, missed, cursed as the man dove behind the overturned table. The cabin was compromised. They were inside the perimeter now, and Jack's defensive advantage was collapsing. He needed to change the equation, needed to do something they wouldn't expect. "Ghost! Out!" Jack commanded, pointing toward the bedroom. The dog obeyed instantly, disappearing into the back room. Jack grabbed the Remington, slung it across his back, and made his decision. If they wanted to fight inside the cabin, he'd take the fight outside. He kicked open the bedroom window he'd deliberately left less fortified, dropped through into the knee-deep snow, and rolled. Rounds tracked him, chewing up the snow where he'd been, but he was already moving along the cabin's back wall, using the structure as cover. The storm was his ally now, reducing visibility to almost nothing, turning the battlefield into chaos. Through the night vision goggles, he saw a figure rounding the corner of the cabin, searching for him. Jack rose from the snow and fired the Remington from 10 feet away. The mercenary fell, and Jack was moving again, circling toward the front of the cabin where he'd heard the shotgun. Ghost appeared from nowhere, snow-covered and fierce, taking down another figure who'd been advancing on Jack's position. The dog was a ghost himself in the blizzard, striking from unexpected angles, creating confusion and fear among men who'd thought they were hunting a single isolated target. But there were still at least 3 attackers left, and Jack could hear them coordinating, adapting their tactics. And then he smelled it, gasoline. They were going to burn him out, destroy the evidence, make sure nothing survived. Jack's blood ran cold. The military container in the cellar might survive a fire, but the journals, the photographs, everything else would be ash. And more importantly, Ghost was still inside or nearby, and Jack would die before he let his dog burn. He moved toward the front of the cabin, staying low, using the truck as cover. Through the storm, he could see flickering orange light. They'd already started the fire, probably using accelerants to make sure it caught despite the snow. Flames were licking up the front wall, spreading faster than seemed possible. A figure emerged from the cabin's front door, silhouetted against the fire. Jack recognized the tall frame, the expensive overcoat. Silas Blackwood had come personally to watch him die. "Callahan." Blackwood's voice cut through the storm. "You can't win this. Come out now, and I'll make it quick." Jack didn't respond, just kept moving, circling. He could see 2 more mercenaries flanking Blackwood, their rifles scanning for targets. The smart play was to take the shot now, drop Blackwood, and disappear into the forest. But Jack needed him alive. Needed him to answer for what he'd done to Miller, to the valley, to everyone he'd hurt. Then Ghost barked from somewhere in the darkness, and one of the mercenaries spun toward the sound. Jack made his choice. He stood, the Remington coming up, and fired. The mercenary dropped. Jack worked the bolt, fired again, and the second guard stumbled. Blackwood turned, his face illuminated by the burning cabin, shock and fear written across his features. "It's over, Blackwood," Jack shouted over the storm. "The evidence is already with the FBI. Mark Chin has copies. Sarah Voss has copies. Even if you kill me, you can't stop what's coming." For a moment, Blackwood stood frozen, the flames reflecting in his eyes. Then he reached for something inside his coat, a weapon, and Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. The sound that cut through the storm wasn't gunfire. It was rotor blades. Multiple helicopters, coming in fast and low despite the weather. Searchlights stabbed down through the snow, illuminating the burning cabin, the bodies in the clearing, Jack standing with his rifle, and Blackwood with his hand still reaching for his gun. "Federal agents, drop your weapons. Now!" The voice boomed from loudspeakers, authoritative and absolute. Jack lowered the Remington slowly, setting it in the snow. Blackwood's hand came out of his coat empty, his face ashen. The helicopters were landing now, black machines with FBI markings, agents pouring out in tactical gear. Sarah Voss had come through. She'd gotten his message, understood the urgency, and mobilized a response team. They must have been staging nearby, waiting for Jack's coordinates or for the dead man's switch to trigger. Either way, they'd arrived at exactly the right moment. Jack raised his hands as agents swarmed the clearing, securing the scene, calling for medics, shouting instructions. Someone tackled Blackwood to the ground, cuffing him as he screamed about lawyers and connections and immunity. But those words meant nothing now. The evidence would speak louder than any lawyer. "Ghost!" Jack called into the storm, and the dog appeared from behind the burning cabin, snow-covered but unhurt. Relief flooded through Jack so intensely he nearly collapsed. An agent approached him cautiously, weapon lowered but ready. "Jack Callahan, that's me. I'm Special Agent Morrison, FBI. Are you injured?" "No, the dog's not injured. But there are casualties, some of Blackwood's men." Jack gestured toward the cabin. "And there's evidence in the cellar under the hearthstone. It needs to be preserved." Morrison spoke into his radio, and a team moved toward the burning structure with fire extinguishers. The cabin was probably a loss, but maybe they could save the cellar, save Miller's original documents. Either way, Jack had copies. The truth was secure. They took his statement there in the snow while the storm raged and the cabin burned. Jack told them everything, finding Miller's evidence, Riggs's threats, Blackwood's bribe, and death threat, the assaults. He told them about Mark Chun and the backup copies, about the dead man's switch, about the systematic poisoning of the valley's water supply. He watched Morrison's face grow darker with each detail, watched the agent's jaw clench as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Mr. Callahan," Morrison said finally, "you should have called us immediately. You put yourself in incredible danger." "I know, but I needed to make sure the evidence would survive. Miller called for help, and they buried him. I wasn't going to let that happen again." Jack looked at the burning cabin, at the home he'd owned for less than a week. "Is Blackwood going to prison?" "With what you've given us, he'll die in prison, along with Sheriff Riggs and everyone else involved." Morrison glanced at Ghost, who sat patiently in the snow beside Jack. "That's a good dog you've got there. Probably saved your life." "He did. More than once." They brought Jack and Ghost to one of the helicopters, lifted off into the storm, and flew to Kalispell, where ambulances and more agents were waiting. Jack spent the next 6 hours being examined, debriefed, and questioned. He called Mark at 05:30, 30 minutes before the deadline, and heard the relief in his friend's voice. He gave his statement to 3 different agents, watched as they compared his account to the physical evidence, and found every detail confirmed. By noon the next day, Sheriff Riggs was in custody. By evening, 2 more county officials had been arrested. The story broke nationally within 24 hours. Major corporation caught poisoning water supply. murdering whistleblower, conspiring with local law enforcement. GeoCorp's stock price collapsed. Silas Blackwood's empire began to crumble. Jack spent a week in Kalispell, giving depositions and coordinating with federal prosecutors. They offered him protective custody, a new identity, relocation assistance. He declined it all. When they asked where he planned to go, his answer was simple. Home. I'm going home. 3 months later, Jack stood in the clearing where his cabin had been, Ghost at his side, surveying the foundation. The burned wreckage had been cleared away by the FBI evidence teams, but the stone hearth remained, blackened but intact. The cellar beneath had survived, and with it, Arthur Miller's original evidence. The insurance money from the cabin's destruction wasn't much, but combined with the reward money from GeoCorp's whistleblower settlement and his savings, Jack had enough. Enough to rebuild. Enough to start over. Enough to create something permanent. Spring had come to the mountains, melting the snow and revealing the poison that GeoCorp had left behind. But the EPA was already working on remediation, and the valley's water was being monitored and treated. It would take years to fully recover, but the healing had begun. Jack pulled out the building plans he'd drawn up with a local contractor. A new cabin, larger than the first, better insulated, more defensible. Not because he expected another assault, but because he'd learned that preparation meant survival. The contractor would start work next week. What do you think, Ghost? Jack asked, and the dog's tail wagged. Think we can build something worth keeping? Ghost barked once, sharp and confident. Jack smiled, the first real smile he'd worn in years. He'd come to this mountain looking for escape, for isolation, for a place to hide from his failures. Instead, he'd found purpose. He'd found a fight worth fighting, a cause worth risking everything for. Arthur Miller's death had been avenged. The truth had survived, and Jack Callahan had finally found a home worth defending. He knelt and placed his hand on the blackened hearthstone, feeling the warmth of spring sun on ancient stone. Thank you, he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Miller, to the mountain, or to some part of himself he'd thought was dead. Then he stood, called Ghost, and walked back to his truck. There was work to do, a cabin to rebuild, a life to construct from the ashes. The nightmares from Kandahar still came sometimes, but they were quieter now, less urgent. Because Jack had learned something important in his brief, violent time on this mountain. Redemption wasn't about escaping the past. It was about choosing to stand and fight for something that mattered, even when the odds were impossible. It was about being willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. And it was about having a good dog at your side when the darkness came. Jack drove down the mountain as the sun set behind the peaks, Ghost's head resting on his knee, both of them heading toward Kalispell and the beginning of whatever came next. The cabin would rise again. The land would heal. And Jack Callahan would be there to see it, no longer running, no longer hiding. Finally, impossibly at peace. The end.